So can science prove or disprove the existence of God and of the human mind? It's a question that sort of intersects a bit of different fields within philosophy itself. It's a question that deals with, of course, the question of God. So it's a sort of theological question, but it's a metaphysical question. It's an epistemological question, a question about knowledge, It's a question also about the philosophy of science. So you have this intersection that is crossed when you ask questions like this: can science prove or disprove the existence of God and of the human mind? The plan for this lecture is to go through some key positions held about the nature of God, about the nature of science, about whether science can address issues that are supernatural, God being one such thing, a supernatural being, and it will take us back. We will be looking at Aquinas, for instance. We will be looking at what Voltaire said and Thomas Paine, as well as people like Bertrand Russell, as well as Friedrich Nietzsche, etc. There are a number of figures that we will be looking at. And first of all, I'd like to run through a few positions, key positions, let's call them, one of which is the theist position, or natural theology, the idea behind natural theology. And this would be rooted in what is known as medieval scholasticism. The figure of Thomas Aquinas reigns supreme when we talk of scholasticism. Aquinas being a 13th century Dominican who spent substantial time working on theological problems. And it's a position, the theist position, the natural theology position, is one that argues that reason and observation can lead to knowledge of God's existence. Once again, the prime example of this is when Saint Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, provides 5 proofs for the existence of God. How does he do that? Of course, it's a rational process. That rational process, Aquinas hopes, leads to truths that go beyond nature. So you have this observation of the natural world, even the idea of cause and effect. It's something we get from nature when we observe nature. And one of the arguments that he gives is, in fact, the argument that God must be the first cause. Now, that is a marriage of thought, of reason, and observation. We observe that there are causes and effects, and we reason that since everything seems to have a cause, and everything is an effect, or a cause in its own turn, for something else, then causes must stretch back infinitely. But at the same time, it doesn't make sense to say that they stretch back infinitely. They have to stop somewhere. That is Aquinas' argument. Where do they stop? They stop at God's feet. God is the first cause. Now, that it's just one of Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God. And the idea is not to repeat or not to go through those arguments themselves. The idea is just to provide an example of how scholasticism, natural theology, theism, tried, or one brand of scholasticism, Aquinas' brand especially, tried to explain that science, that is observation plus rationality, does not exclude theology, does not exclude gaining theological truths. Theological truths being truths about the nature of God. And the complexity, for instance, of the universe. It's so complex, it's such a complex thing that you would have a teleological argument, another argument that Aquinas gives, sort of suggests a design, and he would say, once again, these are arguments trying to explain that science and God do not necessarily exclude each other. Now, one of the problems that theism faces is that, for instance, when you observe the natural world, that does not necessarily lead you to universal truths. So observation of particulars does not necessarily mean that you will arrive at general conclusions. And we can see this when we, for example, discuss inductive arguments. When we look at inductive arguments and we see that this zebra has stripes, that zebra has stripes, therefore all zebras must have stripes, that's an assumption on our side. From our end, we're assuming that so far we've observed this, therefore one would assume that all zebras must have stripes. What do you do then when you meet an albino zebra? Do you say, this is not a zebra, it's something else, it's a different species? We know that it is not a different species because it happens to be a zebra that has something different from other zebras in terms of its chromatic chromosomes, say. But at the same time, we would need to revise our theory of what a zebra is, our inductive theory of what a zebra is, by claiming that zebras are usually striped animals, unless they have a skin condition, a fair condition, something with the color. Anyways, but once again, observation has its own limits. So yes, we can observe nature, we can observe the universe, we can observe the cosmos. We can draw conclusions based on that, but there's always a limit to how sure we can be of our conclusion. So that is called the problem of induction. A second position is that of Deism, Deism, D-E-I-S-M. And to give some historical context for Deism, Deism emerged, Deism sort of formed during the Enlightenment. So we're talking the 19th, end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, and you have people like Voltaire, you have people like Thomas Paine, and the Deism accepts the existence of a creator, say, and you can have rational arguments on this. You can observe nature, and that observation leads you to conclude that there must be a God. Many people do this. They look at nature and they say, but there must be a God. You know, they look at a flower and say, this is too perfect. And someone must have made it. God must have made it, or God must have made it. So, you know, observation and rationality can lead to a conclusion that gods exist. The deists accept this conclusion on the basis of reason and observation of nature. But then the deist stops short of accepting supernatural revelation or miracles, you know, these exceptions that happen in the history of religions and other belief systems, wherein the laws of nature are suspended for the benefit of a minority. That is what miracles are. Or even for the majority, if need be. But it's the basis for a miracle is that it flies in the face of accepted physical and natural laws. Revelation, on the other hand, is when you have knowledge that has been imparted to human beings, to one person or more, and this knowledge comes straight from divinity, from divine beings, be it God himself or some other divinity or divine figures, like you have the figure of the Holy Virgin in Catholicism as well as in other religions. You have the figures of saints in several religions. You have in certain religions even multiple deities. And supernatural revelation is when you, or the existence of angels, say. Supernatural revelation happens when you have deities or supernatural beings that reveal truths to us. Deism denies this. Deism. Now, arguments in favor include what is known as the clockmaker analogy. So, the universe's orderliness is like a clock. It's like looking at a clock. Everything works, seems to be tuned to work together. Everything seems to be connected. Everything seems to happen for some reason. There seems to be a cause for everything, essentially. And this implies a clockmaker. So it's like watching a clock. A clock doesn't just put itself together. A clock doesn't just make itself. A clock needs someone to make it. It's so complex. It's so beyond simple that it just doesn't put itself together. Just doesn't make itself. It needs a clockmaker. Now that's a clock, let alone the universe. The universe, that includes clocks. So the universe, being as complex as it is, must have a maker. That maker would be God, according to the deists, according to Deism. But this entity, this God, this deity, does not intervene in the universe's operation. God, for the deist, is not an interventionist God. So essentially, it's useless to pray. It doesn't make sense for you to pray when things go wrong. It doesn't make sense for you to hope that God will intercede, or that God will intervene, or that saints or angels or other divine figures will intercede on your behalf. And that would be, therefore, a deist approach. Therefore, this also leads then to opposing arguments. This lack of intervention, right? The absence of an observable divine intervention challenges the relevance or existence of a deity. What do we need God for if that God cannot be observed, cannot be seen, and neither can nor can his or her effects be shown to us? Then, of course, you have also this new scientific knowledge that we've gained that opposes a deist view of the universe. You have evolution, you have natural processes, you have scientific explanations for the origin and development of life nowadays. And this diminishes the need for a designer. Once you have a different way how to explain the existence of the eye, and in all its complexity, having a cornea, and then having an iris, and having a lens, and having the cornea, the retina at the back, plus the optic nerve, and the way the muscles move, and all of this seems to tell us that it's such a complex organ, someone must have made it. Yet science has found a way to explain how eyes, in all their complexity, can exist without the need to invoke God. The explanation for that is a natural process. It's a process of selection, a process of evolution that takes possibly millions of years. And not just years, but generations, new generations. Every subsequent generation is ever so slightly different from the one that came before, ever so slightly more adept to its environment. This is how different species have evolved. Essentially, the one that seems to fit best the environment survives, and so then do its offspring. The same thing happens with every new generation. So you have more and more specialization happening. Or rather than specialization, more and more fitting in to the environment. That's at least the way the natural selection process is explained by scientists. Now let's look at yet another position. And this is the atheist position. Sometimes it's called scientific materialism. Why is it materialist? It's because it's excluding anything immaterial. Traditionally, we think of souls as being immaterial, something that goes beyond matter. Let alone then you have people like Epicurus, say, who claim that souls are material. Once the body dies, so does the soul, for Epicurus. And therefore Epicurus is a materialist. He doesn't deny souls, but those souls are materialist. You can be an atheist, you can not deny souls, and at the same time, you can be an atheist, you can be a materialist, and at the same time not deny souls. If you place the soul within the material universe. Now, atheism gained prominence particularly between the 19th and the 20th century, and you have people like Nietzsche, for instance, whom we know claimed that God is dead. We have people like Bertrand Russell, who gave an extremely interesting lecture, and then eventually wrote it down and had it published. Why I am not a Christian. Bertrand Russell being British, being English, and contextually, atheism or scientific materialism denies the existence of God, and often cites the sufficiency, how sufficient it is to have naturalistic explanations for phenomena. So you can explain phenomena through nature. Once again, you can explain the eye, the complexity of the eye. You can explain the complexity of life itself, how dazzlingly varied life is on Earth, through natural explanations. Now, in terms of arguments in favor of atheism and naturalistic philosophy, the empirical evidence seems to point towards God's absence. The further we go, the less space God has to inhabit. In fact, nowadays we have a term for this sort of space that God lives in. We call it God of the gaps. So nowadays, God inhabits just those slim areas that cannot be explained any other way. We used to use God to explain electricity. We used to use God to explain the variety of life. God to explain our intelligence and God to explain morality. Nowadays we have different theories that go behind that, and therefore God no longer is needed for those sorts of things. So what's left are the gaps of knowledge that we still have. In that case, we claim that God still inhabits those spaces and will keep inhabiting those spaces until we find better answers, better solutions, more scientific solutions. And empirical evidence seems to point out, therefore, seems to show us that we don't really have proof for the existence of God. Another argument in favor of atheism can be Occam's razor. Now, Occam's razor is an interesting proposition devised by a medieval philosopher who claimed that the best way to answer, to explain a problem is to go with the easiest, the simplest explanation that you have. Therefore, go for the most obvious, go for the simplest explanation. If you need to insert more variables into your equation than necessary, of course, then you would be overdoing it. Unless you really have to add more variables, stick to the bare minimum. Now, to explain things, if you can stick to a natural explanation, it's better than invoking something else, because that makes it more complex as an explanation. Therefore, using Occam's razor, we'd see that the simpler explanations are preferable, and therefore this would make God an unnecessary hypothesis. If you had to choose between explanations of electricity within scientific consensus versus explanations of electricity having to invoke a supernatural being, the ones that stick to simple naturalistic explanations would be simpler than ones having to invoke something else, an external force. Therefore, the ones that don't invoke an external force, the ones that don't invoke supernatural beings, are simpler, therefore better, according to Occam's razor. Now we also have, of course, arguments against atheism, against naturalistic scientific materialism, and one of them argues for the limits of science. Science may not be able to address questions of a certain sort. Metaphysical questions, for example. It can't answer questions that go beyond the empirical realm. May I remind you, what is the empirical realm? Empiricism, senses, empirical, observation. That is what science can address. If you're taking it further, if you're going beyond what can be observed, if you're taking it in a metaphysical plane, then science is going to struggle there. More arguments against non-materialist phenomena. So there are phenomena that are non-materialist. The experience of things. When we talk, imagine reading an explanation of what a strawberry is versus seeing and tasting an actual strawberry. There's worlds apart. It's one thing being told what a strawberry tastes like, what an orange tastes like, or fish, or whatever tastes like, versus actually doing it, actually biting into an orange, actually having that juice run, that sort of acidic, sweet, citrusy. How can you explain that to someone who has never even smelled anything remotely orangey or strawberry-ish? Therefore, this is where experience comes in. What it's like to actually taste orange, what it's like to actually be a human being, what it's like to read poetry, what it's like to have ice cream, and what it's like to travel, what it's like to be in a different city, a specific city. We've all seen photos of some place, and then you compare the photo to then actually going there. The experience is completely different from just watching a photo. The experience of being there is something you get empirically. And this is similar to having science explain phenomena and sticking to a scientific sort of plane versus then those things that can't be explained by a science textbook. Those things that you have to have. You have to experience. Now, that is just an example. Then you have the metaphysical experiences, perhaps the experience of beauty, experience of peace. How can you explain scientifically what feeling at peace is like? What's it like to be someone on your deathbed, but somehow being at peace? Or how can you explain, likewise, how can you explain someone who's perfectly healthy, but who is a mess emotionally? There is something that goes beyond simple text in a textbook. And therefore, you have experiences, you have phenomena that are not easily explained by materialism. This is a limit to scientific explanations. Now I'll be discussing a fourth position, and this is agnosticism. Thomas Huxley, in the 19th century, coined the term. Thomas Huxley is a very important figure. He was a polymath. His grandson eventually would also become a writer, very important writer, Aldous Huxley. He wrote Brave New World in the beginning of the 20th century. Anyways, but Thomas Huxley, therefore the grandfather now in the 19th century, coined the term agnosticism. And as a philosophical term, this holds, it's a position that holds that the existence of God is unknown or unknowable. We don't know it and we can't know it. This is what agnosticism claims. And since we're making such a claim, we have to back it up. And one of the arguments in favor of agnosticism is what is called epistemological humility. What does that mean? Epistemology, of course, comes from episteme, wisdom, knowing, knowledge, etc. Humility, I humbly declare I do not know. So it acknowledges the limit of human knowledge, agnosticism. It also acknowledges how complex metaphysical questions can be. Questions about the existence of God, questions about the supernatural, these are very complex questions. These are questions that go beyond observation. It's not like you want to observe the density of water, say, so you do experiments in the lab. This is about things that go beyond the lab because they are beyond the physical. Science, once again, limits itself to exploring and explaining physical phenomena, natural phenomena. The supernatural, by definition, is beyond, it's above, it goes well after the natural ends. The supernatural God would be one of those supernatural things, angels, miracles, afterlife, etc. These are supernatural things that science cannot, by definition, it seems, address and even hope to understand. So science, yes, it can provide answers for diversity of life, for how the I exists, but it can't really claim that God does not exist. Why? Because God inhabits a space that lies beyond scientific spheres. It's just not equipped with the tools to discuss theology, science, or to discuss the supernatural. The tools of science are strictly natural. That is why it is so efficient. That's why it's so convincing, because it can provide proof, and it can provide empirical proof. That is what science does. And given, therefore, that through science we can't definitively discuss the supernatural, therefore the best approach would be to acknowledge that there are limits to human knowledge, or at least there are limits to scientific knowledge, and acknowledge also that therefore metaphysics is complex. It's too complex for us. Another argument in favor of agnosticism is scientific uncertainty. Once again, scientific knowledge seems to be provisional. When we answer things, when we give explanation to things in science, that explanation holds until a better explanation turns up, until we have a better explanation for things. So we wanted to explain how the sun seems to rise from this side and then goes down on the other side. We explained it by saying that the sun went around the earth. When we found better explanations for it, then we said, actually, no, it's the earth that goes around the sun, and also the earth is a globe, is a sphere, and also they seem to go around in circles. Well, that explanation held well until we understood that actually the orbits are a bit elliptical. Therefore, the perfectly circular orbits then suddenly became elliptical, more in the shape of an egg than in the shape of a sphere. Anyways, and this is therefore how science approaches questions of knowledge, scientific uncertainty. Now, humility tells us that you can't have this certainty. Therefore, claim that you don't know. It's fine. That would be what an agnostic does. Now, arguments against include the accusation of fence sitting, accusation of just being there sitting on the fence, and agnostics are often accused of just not taking sides. It's easy, of course, life is much easier when you make soft claims rather than hard claims. A soft claim is a claim that doesn't claim much. It claims that I think, and in my opinion, and it seems to me to be the case that these are soft claims, and they can be taken to be a bit of a fence-sitting experiment. You're not really willing to take sides, and therefore you're just avoiding conflict. And that is one accusation leveled against agnosticism. Another accusation is that agnosticism, when you boil it down to its components, you realize that essentially, in practice, the way you apply agnosticism in your life is the same way that you would apply atheism. So in practice, essentially, living life as an agnostic is very much the same as living life as an atheist, and therefore agnosticism often resembles atheism in living as if there is no God. So this accusation against agnosticism basically says that it accuses agnosticism of collapsing into atheism. In practical terms, that is what agnosticism is, therefore. It's another word for being an atheist. Now, of course, the counter-argument to that would be that not everything is about behavior. Not everything is about what it looks like from the outside. Therefore, being an agnostic is more of a philosophical position. It's more perhaps of a spiritual position, a spiritual approach, rather than what you can see me do. It's something more embedded, perhaps it's deeper than what you can observe. Moving on, and we have Fideism or Fideism. And Fideism has a story going back even to Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard, I remind you, would be a very important figure in the 19th century that would have substantial influence on the development of existentialism. Now, existentialism, more often than not, is defined as an essentially atheistic philosophy. I mean, Sartre was an atheist, Camus was an atheist, de Beauvoir was an atheist, Nietzsche, proto-existentialist, was an atheist, Heidegger was essentially an atheist. So it's populated by atheistic figures, existentialism. But then you have a few key figures, especially in the 19th century, like Kierkegaard, like Dostoevsky, who would claim a quasi-existentialist position well before existentialism became a term, and yet they would also have religious beliefs. They would be religious people. And just as parenthesis, not all existentialism is atheistic in nature. You have Christian brands of existentialism as well into the 20th century. So that's a point that is important to bring up. Anyways, so when we talk of Fideism or Fideism, we have people like Kierkegaard, therefore, and also in some ways Pascal, Blaise Pascal. May I remind you Pascal's wager while we're at it. What does Pascal's wager do? It asks us to imagine ourselves at the point of death. Imagine you're about to die, or you've just died, actually. And surprise, surprise, regardless of your beliefs in life, you realize there's an afterlife, and that there, right in front of you, there is God. And the first question God asks you, you're facing eternity now at this point. There's no doubt about that. You can't doubt it anymore because you're dead. But the first question that comes up is, so did you believe in me when you couldn't see me? Because based on your answer, then we can see whether you go to heaven or somewhere else. And if your answer is no, so if your answer is yes, I know it's fine. You know what? Did you love me? Yes. Were you a Christian? Were you a good Christian or a good Muslim, whatever? And your answers are yes, then it's done. Beautiful afterlife, here we come. But if your answer is no, or you know what, I wasn't sure, so I acted as if not, then the prospect of eternal damnation is so overwhelmingly huge, so overwhelmingly impactful. Remember, this is the rest of your infinite life. That it's not worth being an atheist or not believing in the existence of God. Therefore, Pascal's wager tells us to please believe in God if you would like to have a good afterlife. Because if you believe in God, then that's not a problem. If you don't believe in God, then that is the problem. So the best way to go about it is to believe in God. If you believe in God and God doesn't exist, it's not a problem. If you don't believe in God, but God does exist, then that's a problem, my friend. So, but Pascal proposes that we believe in God for this thing, and that's called Pascal's wager. Now, in terms of a philosophical context of Fideism, and it's a position that argues that faith is independent of reason. Because belief in God comes from an act of faith rather than empirical evidence or logical arguments. Now, this seems to contradict Pascal's wager itself, because at the end of it, Pascal's wager is a logical argument. If this, then that, then that. If not this, then not that, for instance. So this also makes us, this also drives us to clarify a bit that there are some interpretations in which Blaise Pascal can be counted as a fideist. Now, in terms of arguments in favor of fideism, there are limits of reason. Human reason is limited, and there, divine truths, on the other hand, divine truths transcend human understanding. They go beyond, well beyond human understanding. And therefore, this leads us to have faith. We can't base us on human reason. Human reason is small. If we want something bigger, then we have to have access to divine truths that aren't accessible through faith. Another argument is that of existential commitment. And when we commit ourselves existentially, we emphasize a personal existential commitment to belief in God. Now, that is, in some ways, what Pascal claims through his wager. You know, we commit ourselves to believe in God. It's a commitment. There's no proof that God exists. It's a commitment that we do to believe in God, or we do not to believe in God, say. Of course, there are counters to this position, and one of them is the claim of irrationalism. And Fideism seems to promote the belief, seems to promote belief without evidence, or even in contradiction to evidence. Because if you claim that faith has to be blind, then even in the face of evidence, you claim, and you can come up with any sort of argument, you know, claiming for that evidence to go against your faith. Because the senses are deceiving me, because the malingenie exists, or because the devil's trying to deceive me, or because this was put there by someone else in order that I, let's take the example of the Bible Belt. in the US of A, and when they see it's an intelligent design argument. We'll see. We'll look at intelligent design shortly. But you have people claiming, and these are strong biblical enthusiasts, and whose interpretation of the Bible is a very literal one, that everything, the world has existed for 6,000 years. Give or take a couple of thousand years, or perhaps 9,000 or whatever, compared to the 13 billion claimed by science. And those 9,000 years are explained through the list of generations leading to Jesus Christ, starting from Adam, etc. And anyways, there we go, 9,000 years ago the world came into existence. And then you have a problem with observations done by scientists in the natural world. One of those would be the presence of fossils. Fossils that go well beyond those 9,000 years. Remember, the dinosaurs disappeared 65 million years ago. 65 million is infinity compared to 9,000. 65 million years ago, fossil records stopped. Boom. 65 million years ago, they stopped. Of course, some dinosaur fossils go back 150 million, perhaps even more, 200 million years ago. But how do you explain then, as an intelligent design person, fossils that can be carbon dated back millions of years if the world has only existed for 9,000? And what these people do is that they say that they would say that even though there seems to be evidence about this, but that evidence is somehow tampered or unreliable, or but even if it says so, perhaps it's the devil, because if the Bible says that it's 9,000, then it's 9,000, regardless of what I discover, regardless of what scientists discover, regardless of your carbon dating, or of your geologists mapping out layers upon layers and dating them meticulously, it doesn't figure in these people's train of thought. And therefore the argument can be, and of course people like this would be counted as fideists in a sense, and therefore the argument would be against them, that if you're a fideist, if you believe that faith is completely separate from evidence, then you run the risk of contradicting the evidence and not really caring about it. Something else, another argument against the fideists, is that of relativism. And it runs on the argument, the objection runs something like this, that if faith is detached from reason, it may lead to conflicting truths between different faiths. And in fact, that is the case. We have conflicting truths between faiths. Why? Because most things that they disagree about would be things that are either matters of faith, truly. Do you believe in angels or not? Matters of faith. You can't prove angels exist. You can't prove angels do not exist. Therefore, it's up to you then to accept. But different religions have different things to say about a lot of different things. These conflicts, these claims are taken to be truths by respective believers, but on the other hand, they conflict between them. Who's right? We can't know. Therefore, you end up, ironically, why? Because religion claims to be objective. All religions claim to have objective truths, yet we end up with relative positions. Relative because it depends on which religion you subscribe to. So essentially, Fideism does end up unknowingly and possibly unwantingly a relativist minefield. Now, let's attack a more contemporary, recent overview. We've seen five. We've looked at five positions, five of the most major positions, and these sort of in the 20th and even now in the 21st centuries, they still have their impact. They still have their influences, and some of them have evolved into more complex positions, and others have evolved into even newer positions, perhaps radically different positions. I'm going to take you through some of these different positions that have and had evolved in the 20th century, and starting with the logical positivist movement and even empiricism. It's the logical positivist movement can be seen. First of all, you have Russell, who we've mentioned already as an atheist. Russell was also a logical positivist. He was an analytic philosopher. And as a movement, logical positivism and empiricism can be seen as an extension of atheism and scientific materialism. And logical positivism emphasizes what is known as the verification principle. What does the verification principle do? It asserts that only statements verifiable through empirical observation or logical proof are meaningful. When we say things, for those things to mean something, to actually mean something, they have to be verifiable. How? Through either empirical observation or logical proof. If we can't do that, then what we're saying would be meaningless. And the arguments are something like this. So you have the verification principle, right? And if we have to substantiate what we say, either through logic or through actual empirical evidence, then metaphysical statements, including those about God's existence, are not empirically verifiable. Therefore, from a scientific perspective, they are considered meaningless. In fact, logical positivism really look down on metaphysics. Metaphysics lost a lot of ground. But for logical positivists, philosophical problems were linguistic problems. They weren't real problems in terms of metaphysical problems. The problems were linguistic. Solve the problems of language, and you have solved the problems of philosophy. A logical positivist would have claimed, and therefore with that disappear such things as metaphysics, as ethics. These are all problems of language. Therefore, you have a position that challenges the meaningfulness of religious language and claims about the divine. Logical positivism had its heyday. Nowadays, there are contemporary critiques to this. Metaphysics was actually, for a while, it was mostly continental activity. You had figures like Heidegger, which we've mentioned already. Heidegger was alive when there were the logical positivists working. You had Sartre, you had the whole German, French philosophers, the whole German/French philosophy brigade of the 20th century, these were all concerned with metaphysics, whilst their British counterparts were mostly into logic. Now, one of the attacks leveled against logical positivism is that the verification principle cannot be verified through empirical observation or logical proof. It is the verification principle itself that can't be verified. So you can verify, yes, the verification principle tells you that in order to verify something, you have to verify it according to logical proof or empirical observation. But how do you verify the statement itself now? You know, if we claim that this statement is a statement that you know, well, if knowledge can only be verified empirically, how can you empirically verify that statement itself? How can you empirically or logically verify the verification principle itself? And that's a problem, because what you're doing there is you're claiming knowledge of something. When you claim the verification principle as a principle to gain knowledge, you're claiming that you have knowledge. No, it's a bit like scratching your own back. It's a circular argument. And circular arguments, as we know, can be fallacious. And therefore, the problem with the verification principle is that it cannot be proven. You can use it, perhaps, to prove other things that depend on it, but it's such a foundational statement that if you need to prove it, you're really stuck. You can't. So in a sense, it becomes self-refuting. It refuses itself because it cannot be verified through empirical observation or logical proof. Yet another critique of logical positivism is that it has a narrow view of meaning. And it excludes many forms of knowledge. It excludes many forms of experiences that are, let's face it, they're considered valuable in human culture. When you discuss ethics, ethics is not something that you can prove empirically. Ethics is an exercise that goes beyond, it seems to go beyond what can be empirically proven. In fact, that would be a fallacy. It would be a naturalistic fallacy to base your ethics on observation. Many a time people say, "Oh, but," and they'd be wrong. I'm just to give you an example. When some people claim, "Oh, but homosexuality is wrong, it's unethical, it's immoral, because if you look at nature, you do not find examples of it." First of all, it's a fallacious statement. Talk to any biologist and they will confirm, not always gladly, but they'll confirm very documented cases of homosexuality and interspecies sexual activity even, so the argument from nature doesn't hold. Same when people say, "Oh, but this is not a natural thing to do." Well, is taking planes to fly to a different place a natural thing to do? I've never seen dogs, invent planes, say, or going to the moon, or, inventing the internet or stuff. So that is not natural. You can't observe, and yet we all use it. We all wear clothes. No other animal wears clothes, as far as I know. So even us, in a natural state, do not wear clothes. Do we take our clothes off now, since that seems to be the natural thing? Us in a natural state? Of course not. And of course, people who claim natural appeal, who appeal to nature, find no problem with acknowledging that they need to wear glasses, even if they were not born wearing glasses, and glasses had to be something to be invented. Right? So that is one of the problems. Once again, it seems to be, there seems to be a relation as well between this fallacy of appealing to nature, appealing to observation perhaps, etc., and the narrow view of meaning, the narrow view of logical positivism in a sense. We have aesthetic experience. How can you describe art? Of course, you can describe art through observing a piece, right? You can do a formalist assessment of the formal elements of a work of art. But when you talk about aesthetic experience, now that is something that can't just be put in words, like I said earlier. You can describe in scientific terms what biting a lemon is like. But until you bite that first lemon, you will never really quite know what that is like, what it's like to bite into a lemon. We will never know what it's like to be a bat. We were not born bats. We can imagine, we can make films about it, read scientific journals and watch documentaries, but we'll never actually know what it's like. Likewise, no other species will actually ever know completely what it's like to be us. And this goes also for the individual. We can think, we can assume, but there is something about the experience of things that can't be put down to logical, in logical or empiricist terms. Religious experiences is yet another thing. Now, whether you believe or not in religious experiences is beyond the point, but some people have religious experiences. Those cannot be explained scientifically. It doesn't mean that people who have religious experience, let me rephrase, sorry. It doesn't mean that if people have religious experiences, then there must be objectively some God or supernatural being that exists. But whether God truly exists or not, whether angels truly exists or not, whether the Holy Virgin or whatever, Buddha or Shiva truly, or Apollo or whatever, truly exists or not, it takes nothing away from the religious experience experienced by believers. That's something else. Religious experience does not have to have a correspondent value outside the person experiencing it. And science can't really say much about them because they fall beyond the observable. Let's look at yet another position of the 20th century, and that is postmodern skepticism. The skepticism of postmodernism. Postmodernism can be seen as a reaction against the certainties claimed by science and reason. Science and reason try to give us certainties, to give us solid proof, and there was a reaction back in the 60s especially. There was the beginning of a reaction against the scientific model of the world. There was a reaction against the scientific revolution and the humanistic approach to things, because humanism, it's true, humanism eventually killed God, but replaced God with us. It took us away from the center of the universe. It's no longer a geocentric universe, but at the same time it gave us infinite powers, infinite mental powers, and in its own way it made us gods. So it stopped making us an image of God, and in turn made us deities, made us the gods. Nietzsche admitted that God is dead, but with the Übermensch he made us gods. And that's quite, it's quite self-important in a sense. It's quite a way how to look at yourself and think of yourself as very important indeed. Because you have powers no other thing in the universe has. You have the power. You are a way for the universe to see itself, to think about itself, to discover itself, to dream of itself and about itself, and to look into the future and to connect the dots of the past. This is something that can't, as far as we know, be done by any other thing in the knowable and so far observed universe. Postmodernism in the 60s, beginning in the 60s, Bataille, you have Derrida, you have a number of figures, reacted against these certainties claimed by science and reason, and including the rationalist and empiricist approaches to knowledge about God. First of all, you have this critique of grand narratives. Humanism brought with it this idea of grand narratives, the idea that you can have narratives that explain everything. You have such narratives in science, such attempts at having this one nice, beautiful, simple theory that perhaps explains everything, that explains the universe. You have theories also in philosophy, you have in anthropology, you have different theories you have theories in aesthetics, in art, you have theories in psychology. These tried to explain everything through some sort of grand narrative. Postmodernists argued against that, and they targeted even narratives of science and of religion. And what they suggested, the postmodernists, what they suggested was that knowledge is contingent, it's contextual, it's constructed by societies. So it's not true that there are universally satisfying narratives. No, what we have are constructed narratives, but constructed by societies themselves. The narrative of how the earth came to be, if we look even historically, the narrative of how the earth came to be varied from religion to religion. Of course there were overlaps, but there were different narratives. Then with humanism, there was the idea that we can finally give a unified narrative for that. With postmodernism, with doubts about science, you have a reaction to 300, 400, 500 years of modernism and this belief in the human being and in our capacities. That is postmodernism. There is a certain plurality, there's a certain fragmentation that postmodernism exposes. Therefore, postmodernism emphasizes the plurality of worldviews and the fragmentation of truth claims. What we consider knowledge is often a matter of perspective. It's often also a matter of power dynamics. Remember that often history is written by the winner. So even when we learn history, what we're reading are narratives that were meant to be that way by an invested party, someone who had the power to leave that. So of course you have this fragmentation. If someone else had won the same war or won the same turf war or whatever, the narrative would have been different, because they would have then decided what should have been noted. Now, of course, you have a criticism of postmodernism, and it's said that postmodernism is relativist and therefore it is nihilist. And let me remind you, we had some nihilist figures in our course, including Gorgias, for instance. The sophists were seen as nihilists. They were seen as relativists. And critics argue then that postmodernism skepticism can lead to relativism. And relativism would be the idea that truth is relative and it varies between individuals and cultures. It also leads to nihilism, and nihilism is the rejection of all religious and moral principles. And therefore this then undermines the foundation, it undermines the basis for meaningful discourse about God. Yet another criticism of postmodernism is that it seems to be incoherent. Postmodern critiques rely on the very concepts of truth and rationality they seek to undermine. When anyone, postmodernist, modernist, ancient, Christian, atheist, whatever, makes a claim that something is true, they are claiming, really, that what they're claiming is universal. Otherwise, why would you say that this is the truth? You know, when people claim something, if the claim that they're trying to claim is that nothing is certain, well, what about your statement? That is an incoherent statement. Nothing is true. What about your statement? Again, it's an incoherent statement. So, of course, one of the criticisms against postmodernists is that in their attempts to claim relativism and stuff like this, at the end of the day, they are contradicting themselves. Another approach is theistic evolutionism, 20th century approach. Now, what is this? Evolution from previous positions is it tries to reconcile theistic beliefs with the acceptance of evolutionary theory. So it moves beyond the conflict model suggested by earlier positions. The Christian Church, the Catholic Church, holds such a position nowadays. It accepts evolution, it accepts the scientific findings, it accepts that you have a heliocentric solar system and this is part of a bigger galaxy, and the galaxy is part of a yet a bigger, what we call a galaxy cluster, etc., etc. And these are scientific findings. Now, the Church, the Catholic Church, acknowledges these. It acknowledges them. At the same time, it tries to reconcile theistic beliefs with accepting such scientific theories. And the arguments they make in favor are, for example, that there is a certain compatibility between scientific theory and theistic beliefs. Therefore, theistic evolutionists would argue that there's no inherent conflict between belief in God and, for example, accepting evolutionary science. They suggest that God could use evolutionary processes as a means of creation. So you can have a God, you can have evolution, but the principle behind evolution is driven by God. So God doesn't actually create pigeons or bulldogs or I don't know, or watermelon. No, what God creates is the principle driving evolution. And then evolution works itself, works its way, but according to those laws decided by God. So God still creates the watermelon, but indirectly. What he creates is the laws according to which eventually watermelons will appear. So they are watermelons' creation of God, but because they follow laws created by God rather than by being created watermelons by God. Another argument is that of divine action, another argument under theistic evolutionism. So, divine action. Theistic evolutionists often propose models of divine action that are not interventionist in the traditional sense. In the traditional sense, when you have an interventionist God, you pray at night before going to bed. You pray that the next day is going to be a nicer day, or that the rain will stop, or that your flight is not delayed. And God suspends, maybe partially, the laws of the universe just to please you and to make things better for you. Now, theistic evolutionists would claim that divine actions are not interventionist in the traditional sense, that God just suspends or forcibly and forcefully intervenes in the workings of his universe, but what they claim, what they see, is God as sustaining the laws of nature through which then evolution operates. So that is divine action for the theistic evolution, for theistic evolutionism. Now, of course, you have also critiques of it. You have contemporary critiques of theistic evolutionism, and one of them is that of scientific reductionism. Now, critics from religious perspectives may argue that this position reduces divine action to natural processes. And when you do that, it seems like you're undermining theistic claims about miracles or about divine interventions. So people who are fond of miracles, therefore, seem to be not quite so fond of theistic evolutionism, because you're taking away that one thing that they like, perhaps, about religion, the idea that God is interventionist, that God is a personal God. You pray to God and God listens to you. Might not always... that God hears you out. Might not always be the case that God listens to you and changes things in your favor. That might not always be the case, but at least it's a personal God. God listens, even if he doesn't quite listen to what you want, quite give you what you want. And for some people, religion is that. Religion is having a personal connection with God. And theistic evolutionism takes away that personal connection with God. Therefore, it's accused very often, theistic evolutionism, of scientific reductionism. It undermines the miracles, it undermines divine intervention. And let's look at another contemporary critique of theistic evolutionism, and that is that some atheists argue that evolution provides a fully naturalistic explanation for the diversity of life. So essentially, the theory of evolution itself does not need to have divine intervention, even at planning level, even at rule level, even at law level. The theory of evolution explains itself You don't need a God to say, but let evolution work this way. No, evolution works that way because it couldn't be otherwise. There needn't be anyone to make the decision. It is just the way things are. So you end up with no role for divine action or divine intentionality. You don't need God's intention to have diversity on earth, so let's make a law that we can call law of evolution, as in we, God speaking, with all the due respect to God. But yeah, imagine God saying that. You don't need that God to say that in an atheistic interpretation of evolution. It's just that evolution works that way, and that's it. And I'd like to move on now to another one. We'll call this intelligent design. This movement is called Movement of Intelligent Design. And intelligent design attempts to challenge materialistic explanations of life offered by scientific naturalism. And once again, intelligent design seems to have lots in common with theistic evolution, but intelligent design also seems to look down on evolution itself. So the commonalities, the common thing between theistic evolution and intelligent design is that you have a designer. With theistic evolutionists, the designer designs the plan for evolution to work. With intelligent design, you have a proposition that certain features of the universe and living things are best explained by intelligent design. So the eye, for instance, the eyeball, it can't have evolved. Intelligent design, theistic evolutionists allow for the eye to have evolved. Of course, there was a plan, a divine plan, but then the ins and outs work themselves out for theistic evolutionists. For intelligent designers, for intelligent design proponents, the eye could only have become an eye if someone, that is God, made it that way. If someone wanted it to be that way. It was not left to chance. And there are several arguments that intelligent design proponents bring, one of them being the argument of reducible complexity. Once again, the eyeball is such an example, you know. It is so complex. And sometimes what they claim, it can be compared to a watch. Imagine you have a nice watch, an old watch, not these today's smart watches, but the ones, you know, the traditional ones that work with all the gears and levers and what have you. Imagine throwing everything in a bag, all the separate components, throw them in a bag, shake the bag for as long as you like. It will never just configure itself to form a complete watch. Even given, perhaps, even given the infinite time. Although we have to be careful when we claim that, because infinite time means infinite time, therefore infinite configurations. Out of infinite configurations, one has to be right. But let's put that aside for a minute. But even given, metaphorically speaking, infinite time, if you shake that bag as much as you like, it will never form a complete watch. You need a designer for that. Why? Because the world, the universe, the cosmos has an irreducible complexity. Therefore, intelligent design proponents would argue that some biological systems like the eye, like the ear, say, like the brain, are so complex. They're too complex. They're far too complex to have evolved from simpler predecessors through natural selection alone. Therefore, you must have an intelligent agent. You must have someone who intelligently designed them. That's called the reducible complexity argument. Yet another argument, the fine-tuning argument. It's another argument brought by intelligent design proponents. The fine-tuning argument suggests that the universe's physical constants are so precisely tuned to allow for life that it implies the existence of a designer. Take the temperature of the earth, right? Or the pressure that we have, or our place in the solar system. We know, we have examples of this. Venus, right? Not much, but closer to the sun. Close enough that it burns up. You couldn't possibly sustain life on Venus. Go far away enough from Earth. Go to Mars, our next planet, and clearly, at least now, because scientists seem to be looking at a Martian past wherein life was possible, but at least now, we live in the Goldilocks zone, essentially. What is the Goldilocks zone? Any closer to the sun and it's too hot, any further away from the sun and it's too cold to sustain life. And therefore, it's so precise where we are that this preciseness implies the existence of a designer. It can't be coincidental. Intelligent design, of course, has its criticisms and its critiques. And one of that is that there is a lack of empirical evidence. So critics argue that intelligent design lacks empirical support. It claims stuff, intelligent design, but those claims about, a reducible complexity and about fine-tuning have been refuted by developments in biology and cosmology. Say, the argument of the eye, the complexity of the eye. This has been explained. Richard Dawkins, whom we'll be seeing very, very shortly when we do New Atheism, and then we wrap up this lecture. But Richard Dawkins explains how evolution across millions of years and across millions of generations leads to complex things like the human eye. It starts off by simply having even one cell that is photoreactive. If it's bright, it can tell. If it's too dark, it can tell. That's it. You start from that. Give it millions of generations, millions of years, even thousands of species to evolve through, and bit by bit you end up slowly with something as complex as the human eye, or as the eye of today, say. Yet another critique of intelligent design is that it is not scientific. And many in the scientific community argue that intelligent design is not science. It invokes supernatural explanations. Again, what's the problem with that? Well, if you're going to stick to religious arguments, there's no problem. But if you're going to claim that intelligent design is scientific, then it runs into the problem of it not being testifiable, it not being falsifiable. Science is testifiable. Science is falsifiable. What does that mean? It means that when I make claims in science, those claims still can be falsified. What does it mean? There are parameters that allow my statements to stand. If I change those parameters, if I find new evidence, that evidence falsifies my statements. My statements hold water as long as I stick to them. They can't be true and not true at the same time. Whereas, usually, when you have science, when you have religious claims, those claims are as slippery as eels, you know? You say something, it's sunny today. God wanted it to be sunny. Okay, so God wants it to be sunny. But at the same time, you know, if for 5 seconds the sun the rain comes out and it starts pouring, but God wants it, it's still good, you know, sun or rain, it's all good. Why? Because God wants it. Now, that means that whatever you say, it can't be falsified. God wants this, God wants that. Even if there's conflict, your answer would be, because God works in mysterious ways. We can never understand that. We can never understand God's mind. What does that mean? It means that God's mind is beyond reason. It's beyond empirical observation. It's beyond logic. Sometimes even you'll find people claiming that we lack the necessary rationality, the necessary logic to understand God's mind, which essentially means that whatever someone religious claims, you can't falsify them. That makes it non-scientific. Now, to wrap up today's lecture, let's look at New Atheism. And New Atheism emerged more or less 20-25 years ago in the early 2000s, and it was a more vocal, more public form of atheism. It built upon atheistic and scientific materialism, the perspectives of scientific materialism of the past, but it then distinguished itself through having this clan of outspoken critics, very vocal critics of religion, and they advocated and still advocate. They're now, those who are still living are quite elderly nowadays, but you have people like Richard Dawkins, you have people like Dennett, you have people like Sam Harris. There was also Christopher Hitchens, who now is died a while ago. These guys were very vocal. Sometimes they were called the Four Horsemen of New Atheism, in their very vocal opposition to religion and religious explanations of natural phenomena. Some of their arguments include empirical rationalism. Now, New Atheists argue for a worldview based on science and empirical evidence. Like previous atheists, they reject religious faith as irrational. Therefore, it's very important for them to be skeptical, to think critically. The scientific method is fundamental to understand reality. So that's one point that they bring. A second point that they make is that religion is actually not just something neutral or that it doesn't give you truths, but it's actually something harmful. So it's not only incorrect, the thing with religion, according to New Atheists, is not only that it gives you incorrect information, but it is harmful to society. And they cite examples, especially when New Atheism came out in the beginning of the 2000s. It was the time of the attacks on 9/11, for example. These were religious motivated attacks. Or at least that was the explanation given. These were attacks all based on claims of faith in a particular, they were attacks in the name of God or some particular God. So new atheism came out. Also, the context helps to understand as well their strong position against religion, against their claims that religion is harmful. You have religiously motivated violence, you have oppression. You had, for instance, when the Taliban took over in 2001 in Afghanistan, when they destroyed the Bamiyan Buddhas, old, centuries old Buddhas, huge Buddhas. They exploded them essentially. For Islamic fundamentalists, so again, you have this suppression of science, suppression of reason, suppression of other beliefs. So new atheists, in response, advocated for an idea that society would be better off without religious beliefs. So they promoted secularism as a way, as a path to moral and intellectual progress. Another claim that they made was that science was a superior framework. It offered a superior framework to understand the universe, to solving human problems, to determining ethics. So they engaged. They had some very public debates, and in which new atheists took part. Some very interesting debates with top figures, religious figures, and even scientists and spiritual leaders here and there, and they would use those debates to debunk religious claims, to argue that naturalistic explanations provided by science are more coherent, they're more useful, they are verifiable, they're more verifiable than supernatural explanations. Now, of course, you had also critiques of new atheism. Their perceived militancy, they are perceived a bit as intolerant. When you watch them, when you read them, let me quote one name. God is Not Good. That's an actual name of a book by one of them. The God Delusion. They are strong names. And the content is even stronger, it's even harsher. It attacks religious people as deluded. So critics of new atheism often they point this out. They are so militant, so intolerant, really. So in a sense, their approach now, rather than the belief itself, but their approach to atheism and their approach to beliefs, ironically, sometimes it mirrors the same dogmatism, the same proselytizing that it criticizes in religion. And therefore this approach, this new atheist approach, can, rather than pull people in, it can actually alienate religious individuals who might otherwise be sympathetic, who might actually, be interested in secular or scientific perspectives. They find these horsemen, and instead of, being attracted to it, being open to it, they suddenly feel that they're under attack. So, of course, what do people do when they feel they're under attack? They shut up. They close themselves off, or they fight back. So instead of making friends, they're making enemies. Yet another critique of new atheism is the complexity of religion. So critics also argue that new atheism oversimplifies religion. It ignores how nuanced and multifaceted the roles that it plays in people's lives, in societies. Religion is complex. Religions are complex. Societies are complex. And new atheism, in trying to, whitewash all religion out of people's lives, it ends up overlooking the cultural, the ethical, the existential dimensions of religion, and that these contribute to human experience. It's beyond literal belief It's beyond literally believing supernatural claims. And this brings me to one final point. I'd like to make one final critique of new atheism, and that concerns ethics and meaning. So some would argue that new atheism provides an incomplete account of ethics and meaning. And these people would claim that science, the new atheists, some of them claim that science alone can serve as a foundation for morality and purpose. However, not everyone agrees with such a thing. Critics of that claim suggest that moral reasoning and what we call the search for meaning, the search to give our lives a more meaningful existence, are complex human endeavors. You just can't fully address them, you can't fully explain them by empirical science alone. Like I said before, there's something about the lived life that you can't quite get out of reading a textbook. There's this term that we use in philosophy called qualia or qualia, sometimes Qualia, the quality of lived experience, these qualia. And the quality of lived experience is not something that you find in scientific textbooks. Likewise, the quality of living a good life, the quality of being an ethical person, the quality of being happy. You can explain pheromones and endorphins and what you like, but you can't just base yourself on scientific notions. Otherwise, you'd be doing a disservice. It's a reductivist view of what it is to be human, of what it is to exist, or what it means to exist, and that brings us to a close for today. We've looked at an overview of how science and religion have been viewed, whether they're compatible, whether they are not, and whether science can prove the existence of God or the existence of the human mind. We've seen atheism and natural theology. We've looked at Deism as well as atheism and scientific materialism. We've had a look at agnosticism and Fideism and logical positivism, postmodernism, theistic evolutionism, intelligent design, and new atheism. Next time we will have a part 2 to this lecture, where we will then go into questions about what is God. We'll look at ideas of God as something that is innate, or at God as something that is derived from experience. But anyways, that will be for another lecture.